Welcome to Lab 5. Today we're going to be talking about the methods section. In our discussion of the methods section, we're really going to be covering two parts, which are how to write the methods section and then the different parts of the methods section. Thinking about our project, where does the methods section lie? Well, it goes right after the introduction. The introduction is when you talked about what you were studying. You're going over all the variables, and that's something you're working on now. Specifically, you should be really dedicated to the literature review, which will then be incorporated into the introduction, which is what we talked about last week. But then after you've talked about what you're studying, what you're interested in, why you have the hypothesis that you do, you're then going to describe your actual research study and the how you did it. So the methods is the how did you conduct the study. In our case, we conducted a survey. Remember that survey you took at the beginning of the semester that I asked you for? Well, that's the project, right? So we are conducting a survey here, and that's really what you have to describe. You want to talk about what measures and manipulations were used in this study. For us, it's just what measures were in the survey. There were a bunch of available ones, and you chose two variables that you were interested in. So you should talk about how those variables were measured, how those operational definitions were defined. And the reason we want this section is for not just so you have a documentation of what you did for your own sake, but also so that we can understand the validity and the reliability of your study. We can look at what the measures are, and as an outside reader of your project, think about, does this method make sense? Do I agree with the measures they used to follow up to measure their variables? Do I like their operational definitions? And if I'm comparing to another paper, how does their operational definition differ from somebody else's? I can also find out about the generalizability to understand the internal validity or the external validity. Who are the participants who were in this study? What population does this finding kind of identify? Who does it apply to? So this validity and reliability we've been talking about all semester so far is going to start in the methods section. There's also a big push towards replication in the social sciences these days. That's the idea that somebody can come back and redo your study and get the same findings. If they had the exact same population or a very similar one, they used the exact same measures, they did the same analyses, they should come to the same result that you did. And so for that to happen, you have to describe what you did. Who was your population? What were your measures? So that it could theoretically be replicated. The measures section for me should be that if you come up with a great study and you write your measures and your methods, and then you get hit by a bus crossing the street, somebody should be able to come behind you, pick up what you wrote, and do the rest of the study themselves. So kind of a morbid thought, but the replication aspect, this high definition of what you did so that somebody could recreate your work, is very important. Because remember, science is iterative. Science is people building on what's already been done. So they have to be able to know what you've done and be able to recreate it and add their own little variation. So the common subsections of the methods section are thus. We have participants, so who was studied, the measures and materials as already described, and then the procedures. How did you actually go about the process of getting participants and administering your measures and materials? The first section, participants. In here, you're going to describe the population that you pulled from. Specifically, you're going to describe your sample, which is a subset of the population. So you're going to tell the reader what were the demographic characteristics of your sample. This is generally going to include stuff like gender, age, ethnicity, but it can also go to more detail, like the school that they're at, what grade in college they are, which could be an important one for you. So we have a lot of different demographic information that helps to describe who this participant sample was so that people can understand, again, that generalizability, that external validity associated with your study. You also want to describe how large your sample was and were there any dropouts? How many people actually took the study? Were there any participants who were intentionally excluded and why were they excluded? How did you go about getting these participants? Because the kind of participants who raised their hand and said, yes, pick me, might be different than ones that are just directly you go to them and ask them. there's a lot of sampling that comes into how we get our participants that make sure that there's not accidental systematic bias by only bringing in certain subpopulations into your study. Another kind of similar idea with this inclusion and exclusion is the compensation. It's very different population of people who are paid versus those who are not paid to take part in a study. A lot different motivations and maybe some reactivity depending on whether they were compensated or how they were recruited. So all of this information that helps to describe your participants, helps to understand that external validity, all of that goes in your participants section. Now that last slide was talking about the general things that you're seeing in a participant section, and by now you've seen at least 3 participant section in other papers, so you know kind of what information is available. But for your specific methods participant section, you're going to have to go into SPSS and do that descriptive statistics stuff that we got from week 1. Remember going in and finding out what the average age and the frequency of males, females in that sample data file? You're going to have to do that all yourself with the data that I'm going to provide you for this survey, which is to come in next week. So for this, you have to do descriptive statistics to get the average age, as well as the minimum and maximum age. So what is the youngest person and who's the oldest? This is to help identify any kind of skew in the data. You also want to include the gender breakdown, as well as any racial breakdown that's there, to help understand the external validity, who is in your sample. If you are doing a t-test that is involving a demographic variable as another important variable in your analysis, this is where you would include that as well. So if you were looking at relationship status or religion as a variable, you should put that in your participants so we understand what groups are you looking at, what kind of relationship status is generally there in your sample. Again, I'm going to share all of this, all the data with you in a future week so you can begin to break it down in SPSS. So here's an example of what it looks like. Again, you've seen at least three papers that highlight all this information, but here we see the younger adults, and they're the descriptive of those younger adults. There's 14 women and 10 men. You have the average age of 19 and a half, and it ranges from 18 to 22. What that tells us is that this is clearly a college age and a normative college age sample. And then we later see they were recruited with flyers from a Boston College campus. So it is a college sample and they are recruited. There are also older adults as the secondary sample here. This is 15 women, 9 men. Average age is 76. So a lot older of a population with a range of 68 to 84 years old. These were recruited from Harvard Cooperative on Aging. So here we see what are the 2 samples that are used in this project, and we have all of that general descriptive statistics. The participants were compensated $10 for their participation. That's great for us to know. There was some incentive there. And you had 30 participants who were recruited in the same way as described, who were used for pilot studies. So the researcher wanted to understand how participants were responding to the question. Did the question make sense? In lecture, I talked about how you sometimes want somebody from the sample to look over your questions and help you to edit the questions before you send it out to all of your participants. Well, that's what that pilot rating was for. And this just shows that the pilot study group looked pretty similar to the actual younger adult and older adult samples. So there was reason to believe that the measures were valid and useful in the actual study. All participants were asked to bring corrective eyewear if needed to make sure that there was no systematic bias for the older group versus younger in terms of sight, and they normally corrected for that. So here's all the information that's needed about the participant. It's very straightforward. There's no high art to the information that's provided. It's just the details of who was in, and anything extra we need to know to make sure that there's no systematic bias and there's no problems with any kind of external validity. Here's another example. Again, we're going to see the same thing. Here it's a larger sample, 416 participants. We see a percentage of them were female, about a third of them, and we have the range of age as well as the average and the standard deviation in the age. The greatest were a proportion were students. We also had some part-time unemployed and self-employed, so describing how much work, because this is probably a study that's talking about full-time employment or employment in general related to their other variables. This also talks about their nationality, which might be important in the paper as one of the variables. So knowing a little bit about that population is important here. This is also a study that is looking at how much time people spend playing these MMORPGs, those mass multiplayer online RPGs. And so we want to know how many of them actually play these for this study. All right, again, this looks slightly different, but it's got a lot of the same information as the last example. So you can look at either and look back at the 3 papers that you've already read through and make sure that what is consistent across them, what kind of information, and you want to make sure that you are doing that same kind of information in yours. After the participants section comes the measures section, and this is where you describe all of the scales that you asked. If it was a self-report study, what were the questions that you asked? Did you do it through a survey? Did you do it through an interview? If it was an observational study, what were you observing and how were the different checklists operationalized? Was it an open-ended? Did the participant know that they were being observed or not? Was it concealed? Was there any kind of reactivity that was assumed in this? So we want to include all of those measures, all of that stuff that we just talked about for observational and self-report studies in lecture. That pretty much goes in this measures section. So you need to make sure you provide both the name of the variable with the operational definition and the full detail of the measures. So this is not just describing, oh, I had a survey about anxiety, but what were the items on the anxiety? How many questions were there about anxiety? Where was these questions pulled from? Who originally created this anxiety scale? What were the anchors? Like how many, was it a 1 to 5 scale, a 1 to 7, 1 to 10? All of these details are going to go in the measures section. And next week, we're going to go over in detail what the measures on our survey actually were so that you can see those in more detail. That being said, all of the measures are available on Canvas currently. So go on to Canvas and you can pull up the PDFs or Word documents that have the measures there. Take a quick look at them now. And of course, we're going to go into more detail with them next week. Once again, some things to think about in the measures and materials section. You want to describe the type of measure, going back to the lecture and describing the observational or self-report style. Are they forced choice or fill in the blank, open-ended, Likert scales? How were the participants actually engaging in responding to the questions that were asked, or how were they being observed? So for us, we are describing each of the scales that were used in that survey, or the ones that are applicable to you. Now, I want to be clear here that you are not writing the measures for every scale that was in the survey, just the ones related to the variables that you are talking about in your paper. So you don't have to be comprehensive across all scales, but you want to be comprehensive within the scales that you are using. For each measure that you describe, so each variable that you used, each measure assessing that variable, you need to name the measure. You need to include an in-text citation of where did that measure originally come from, who invented it. You didn't come up with the question. You didn't come up with this anxiety scale or the depression scale or the college stress scale. It came from somewhere, so give credit where credit is due. You want to do that in-text citation. You include the number of items that were in that scale. What were the anchors? Anchors, again, are the high and low values. So 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. You want to give at least one sample item so that it gives some context for the reader to understand the formatting of the question. And then you include that Cronbach's alpha. Remember, the Cronbach's alpha is an assessment of inter-item reliability, where you're seeing how each of the questions correlates with each other. Then you average all of those correlations together and you get the fancy Cronbach's alpha. We're going to be calculating that next week. Once again, all of this information is on Canvas. So go to it to start looking at it. We're going to go into a lot more detail on the Canvas and on the survey coming next week. As an example of the materials section, here is the body shape questionnaire, or the BSQ. You can immediately see here is an in-text citation of where the BSQ came from Cooper, Taylor, Cooper, and Fairborn in 1986. It is a commonly used 34-item measure that assesses body image dissatisfaction. So that's clearly describing what it is and how many items are there. The participants responded to a 5-point scale. There's how many points. And then the anchors are never to always, with the assumption being that 1 is never and 5 is always. And the responses were scored such that higher scores indicated higher body image dissatisfaction. So this helps to frame what does a positive correlation or negative correlation, when you're seeing higher scores, what do they actually mean? It also talks about the test-retest reliability there, some discriminant validity and other types of validity, and then the Cronbach's alpha is right at the end with a 0.97. So it's making it clear that this is a good scale. It is going to usefully help us to understand body image dissatisfaction for this current study. As another example of a self-report scale, here's the Conformity to Feminine Norms Inventory. This is a longer scale that has some subsections on it, subscales. So this is a 45-item scale that has 9 factors, each of them about 5 items ascribed to each of those factor subscales. And so that's why the example items are really important. Here we have the different subscales of relational, sweet and nice, invest in appearance, and a sample item from each, so that as the readers, we can have a really good idea of the kinds of questions that are asked for each of these subscales. You can skim through all that, and then you get to the end and you see that responses are on a 4-point scale, with higher scores indicating greater conformity and ostensibly lower scores indicating lower conformity to the feminine norms that were just described. It also tells you that there are mean, standard deviation, Cronbach's alphas, but here, because there are subscales, the writer has decided to put them somewhere else instead of in the text. But they are available, and that's an important part. With the materials section, all of this information needs to be there in some way that's accessible. Where it is doesn't matter as much as whether it is there. The last section is the procedure section, and this is after you've described who you're sampling and what you used, you tell how you went about using those materials to sample from those participants. So you are summarizing each step of the research, and this is particularly for that replication, that get hit by the bus, somebody else can do it. Or 20 years, 30 years from now, when you've gone off and done other things, somebody can come back and say, I'm really interested in that study. I want to see if I can do it again now that 30 years have passed. Does it still hold up 30 years later? In here, you include who you selected and how they completed the study. How many sessions did the student go through? Was it just one survey, or did they have to come back for more? Was there some kind of test-retest in your process? What kind of instructions were they given on how to fill it out? Was there any leading into it or framing of the project that might affect how they responded? How was it done? Was it online? Was it in person? Was it over the phone? And how long did it take to go about the process? So for us, you're going to have to look through the survey and get a sense of how was it introduced in that first kind of opening paragraph? How were you solicited from me, who was reaching out to you to ask you to fill out the survey? I'm going to give you the information about how long the survey took, though you kind of have an idea yourself. Whatever your experience was pretty close. So we're going to give a few of those, but you want to make sure that it is replicable. You're given all of that information about how it was done. And here, it's good to keep in mind that a survey is probably the easiest procedure to describe. Okay, there was a bunch of measures, we put it in a survey, we sent it to the participants, and they took it. Great. But a lot of experimental processes, a lot of experimental research is much more involved than the procedure. And you might find experimental studies that have procedure sections that go on for pages. I did a study once where it took me 4 pages to describe the step-by-step process of exactly how the participant was coming into the lab to experience a stressful experience, and then went through a survey, and then also went to their significant other, and then came back and redid this experiment. I mean, what they did in the lab took about an hour, and there were so many different elements to it, and I had to describe every single piece of it. So these procedures can get quite heavy, but for a survey, it's going to be pretty light. As an example of a procedure section, here we have it. Participants were recruited from a undergraduate participant pool and from psychology courses at a large public university in the southeastern United States. All right, so here we have general details about the recruitment process. The survey was administered online through a survey system hosted at the author's institution. Great. And participants were informed that the study was about gender roles and self-perception. So this is information about what's priming the participants as they go in. They know they're going to be answering questions about gender and self-perceptions. Participants first viewed a page containing the informed consent and the IRB approval for the study. IRB is something we're going to talk about in our ethics section, making sure that there is consideration of the participants' experience. They're not going to be asked anything that's going to make them super uncomfortable or cause problems emotionally or in any way. They clicked the link indicating that they consented, and they began the survey. When they finished it, they went to a debriefing page which explained what they had been filling out and why they were filling it out, and it reiterated the thank you and researcher contact information. We're going to be talking more about informed consent and debriefing when we get into experimentation, because especially when you're doing manipulations, it's very important. But this is something that you can consider putting in the procedure when you are writing your study. Oh, and then finally, there's course credit that was allowed by instructors, so a little bit of an incentive there. You see, this is pretty brief. This is only a paragraph there, and the procedure is done. And similarly for your study, the survey doesn't take much to describe. It should be about a paragraph. But if you ever write a study that has a much more involved process, this procedure can get pretty big. When you are writing your method section, you also want to be careful that you don't include any scales or demographic questions that we didn't actually assess in our survey. So you can look through what items we did include in the survey, and that should be the most that you can include. Yes, you may find some other different ways of measuring a variable in the research that you're reading and collecting, but if we didn't collect that data, you can't talk about it in your measures. Also, we collected a lot more variables than what you are using. You have just chosen 2 variables to analyze out of the 7 or 8 that are available. So you are only going to, in your measures, the actual materials, talk about the 2 variables that you actually care about in your study. You don't have to mention the other ones. The only exception to this is for demographic. Even if you're not using age or race as a variable, you still need to provide that information about your participants. All of the information for the scales from our study are posted on Canvas. You can find them under the final paper resources information for scales folder. There's also a document for a description of the scales and all the variables. While you're thinking about how to write your methods, make sure to use the resources that are available on Canvas. I've already shared with you the summarizing a research article, but you also have the introduction section guide, and now there is a methods section guide up there as well. You can also see a full final paper, what you are working towards. There's an example paper there. And then you have all the information for the scales in the information for scales folder that's on Canvas. So all of the details that we just went over in this method section about how many items there are, what are the anchors, who originally created that scale, all of that is in that folder along with the demographic and scale information document. I think that demographic and scales is one layer up, but these are all in the final paper resources folder. So this is your go-to place on Canvas. I'll make sure to link that final resources folder to the page for this week, but make sure to dig through it, see what's there. There's a couple of extra things as well that we haven't really gotten to yet, but make sure to know what's available for you. As a final summary and reflection on your method section that you're going to be writing in many weeks, it's kind of far off down the horizon, but the participants section should rely heavily on descriptive analyses of the data. So that's what we're going to be doing when we see the data next week. We're going to get in SPSS. We're going to start getting those descriptive statistics. The measures section will require all that information about the scales that is currently posted on Canvas, You can start looking at it now, and I'll give you a little bit more details next week. And then you have the procedures section, which describes the whole survey. So whereas the measure section only has the details for the ones that you are analyzing, the procedure section can reference that there were other variables assessed. There's a, kind of comprehensive survey that was sent out, but you're reflecting on the process of conducting the study, not so much the individual measures that you were using. All right, so I told you it was coming. Here is your data first look. So we're going to do more with it in future weeks, but I still want to put it out there so you can start seeing the data that you have submitted for. So this is under the final paper resources folder on Canvas. Go to download survey data s25_clean.sav. That is an SPSS file. You can open it in SPSS to see the actual data. And then you want to reference that demographics and scale information document that I talked about on a past couple slides for details about those variables. Feel free to look around, play with it, see what the different labels are for each of the variables, because next week we are going to be running descriptive statistics for it. If you want to get a jump start, you can practice now, but we'll definitely be talking about that next week. Have a great one.